The collection of French Impressionist paintings in the National Gallery is not large and was formed relatively late in the history of the museum. British taste in the 19th century had been too conservative to approve of this new style, and a degree of rivalry between French and British artists may also have contributed to the early neglect of this style. Fortunately, two donors made a big difference in helping to change this neglect. Sir Hugh Lane, an art dealer and collector, donated modern paintings, including Impressionist works, to the National Gallery. He died in the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, and in 1917 the paintings came to the National Gallery, though they came with a complicated sharing arrangement with the Dublin City Gallery, which Lane, an Irishman, had founded in 1908 as a museum of modern art. The industrialist Samuel Courtauld left funds to the gallery in 1923 specifically for the purchase of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings. His own painting collection eventually opened to the public as the Courtauld Gallery separately, but this bequest was extremely important for shaping the collection differently. Many of the works in this lecture are in the collection of the National Gallery because of Hugh Lane and Samuel Courtauld. In truth, even in the 1920s and 30s, the taste of the trustees was so conservative that Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings might not have entered the collection for decades more had it not been for these two benefactors. The National Gallery has continued to focus on collecting in this area, and through purchases and gifts from donors has built up quite an impressive one that in quality, if not quantity, can compare with the best in the world. Before moving directly to Impressionism, though, we need to look at one more French painting from the 1850s, Ingres' Madame Moitessier, signed and dated 1856, one of 5 paintings by Ingres in the National Gallery. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, whose dates were 1780 to 1867, born in Montauban, was trained in Toulouse and later in Paris, with Jacques-Louis David, the leading neoclassical artist we saw in Lecture 20. In 1806, Ingres went to Italy, where he remained until 1824. More than any other French artist of his generation, he revered the classically oriented painters of the past, especially Raphael and Poussin. Ingres always wanted to be considered a history painter, but portraiture was a significant part of his artistic career. Marie-Clotilde Inès de Foucault-Moitessier was 35 at the time Ingres finished her portrait. Monsieur Sigisbert Moitessier had first approached the painter about making a portrait of his wife in 1844. It was actually begun in that year, but put aside for some reason and not finished until 1856, 12 years later. Clearly, the sitter's appearance would have changed over this time, but the painting is such an idealization that Ingres may not have worried about such a detail. Her face seems like a perfect rounded oval. Her hands are elegant and unwrinkled, almost boneless. Her skin a flawless pale shade. While her features are individualized enough to allow for a likeness, the idealization here nearly lifts the depiction out of the realm of portraiture. It should not be surprising, then, to find out that the pose was derived from an ancient Roman fresco depicting a goddess. Ingres, with his reverence for antiquity and the masters of the Renaissance, was quick to incorporate such references to ennoble the ordinary subject of portraiture, somewhat like, say, Reynolds in 18th century England. Yet there is almost a kind of hallucinatory clarity to the meticulous depiction of the dress and the setting, including the mirror with the sitter's profile reflection. There is tension in this image underneath that may be explained by a recent technological innovation, the invention of photography announced to the world in 1839. Ingres proudly included his own age, 76, on this portrait as a way of indicating that he was still at the top of his game. Publicly, he denounced photography and denied it any place in the realm of art. Privately, he was said to have had some of his portrait sitters photographed for reference. Madame Moitessier seems to emphasize Ingres' ability to reproduce the stuff of the world as well as any photographer, or frankly, even better at this point, since color photography was decades away. At the same time, he asserted aesthetic control through his ability to idealize his sitter in the midst of such imitative art. No photographer could do that, he surely believed. It is a fascinating portrait, but one that ultimately represents the past and not the future of French art. Paul Delaroche, a history painter, had exclaimed in 1839 after seeing one of the first photographs, "From today, painting is dead." He was both quite right and very wrong, as we shall see. For the Impressionists would respond to modern life, including photography and the challenges it posed for painting, in a way that reinvented painting itself. First, we'll start with one predecessor to the Impressionists, Edouard Manet. Manet was almost a father figure to the Impressionist painters, and he shared their interest in the depiction of the modern world they knew, but he never actually exhibited with them and maintained ties to the official art world by exhibiting at the Paris Salon. Manet, whose dates were 1832 to 1883, was from an affluent Parisian family which had expected him to go into law and which took some time to accept his career choice. He studied with Thomas Couture in Paris beginning in 1850, was able to travel widely seeing art of various periods and countries. Manet would draw on his wide-ranging visual experiences in creating both history scenes and depictions of modern life, many of which seem shocking when first viewed by his contemporaries. One look at this portrait, Eva Gonzalez, dated and signed 1870, displays considerable differences from Ingres's approach to portraiture in Madame Moitessier. Rather than seeing a woman of leisure, Manet depicts a fellow painter. Eva Gonzalez became a pupil of Manet in 1869, and he may have begun this portrait right after she joined his studio. He exhibited it in the Salon in 1870 in the spring. Gonzalez is shown in the act of painting while seated, the traditional pose for a painter right up into the 19th century. She works on a still life already framed. Think of the very earliest paintings we saw in this course that were also framed before painting. She supports her hand with a maul stick. All of this is conventional, and for centuries, still life in particular had seemed the most appropriate subject for a woman to paint. She unrealistically, however, wears a white gauzy dress, certainly not studio attire, but her appearance is decidedly unidealized, again, especially if we compare her to Madame Moitessier. Her round face and her prominent nose do not accord with conventional ideas of beauty, but her air of absorption in her task makes her sympathetic. Her gaze away from the painting is an indication, for instance, that painting is not just a physical act, but an intellectual effort as well. Note the flower that sits on the carpet, suggesting that she worked from nature here. Ironically, this may be a fiction, in one sense at least, for scholars argue whether the still life was actually hers or another painting by Manet. A few years earlier, Manet had painted a scene of modern life called Music in the Tuileries Gardens, signed and dated 1862. His friend, the writer Charles Baudelaire, was encouraging Manet and other artists to paint the reality of their world, not the past. It was not just a random slice of life in Paris, however, that he shows here, but in fact, it is about Manet's life specifically as interpreted through art. We see the painter himself at the far left of the image, and here he is accompanied by a number of friends who were painters, novelists, critics, and artists. Just one example, we have the writer of operettas, Offenbach, leaning here against a tree. They converse and mingle in the fashionable crowd who gather in this garden for a concert. These were very popular events at this point in Paris. Manet's approach to the composition is to emphasize the flat silhouettes of the figures and trees and thus suppress the impression of spatial depth. First with Courbet and now with Manet, we see artists moving away from the Renaissance conception of a painting as a window to focus instead on the application of color and creation of form on a flat surface. So rather than the illusion we're looking through the painting to a scene, we are meant to pay attention to that flat surface itself. Note how the central portion of the painting almost looks unfinished, and the cursory way some figures are painted here, denying any sense of depth. Likewise, the setting itself dissolves into brushwork of different colors rather than suggesting movement into space. And these were elements that contemporary viewers and critics, at least some of them, really found very disturbing and threatening. The various social and artistic implications of Manet's art would be built on by the painters who would come to be called Impressionists. One of the best known of them was Claude Monet. Monet, whose dates were 1840 to 1926, grew up in Normandy at Le Havre and began painting out of doors in 1856. Monet relocated to Paris in 1859, where he studied with Charles Gleyre and met Renoir there. After spending part of 1870 and 1871 in London, he returned to Paris, where a group of young artists with similar aims coalesced and first exhibited together in 1874. And they did that in part because their art had been rejected by the official Salon. Monet is still today the most famous of these painters, the Impressionists, and the one most devoted to landscape. The National Gallery owns 12 paintings by Monet. 2 of them were just bequeathed to the gallery in 2006. Again, another example of how this gallery never stays in one place. It changes over time itself. Bathers at La Grenouillère from 1869 was considered by Monet to be a sketch made out of doors for a finished painting that unfortunately no longer exists. But it would be a very short step from this painting to the exhibited works of the 1870s. Actually, Monet called this a bad sketch, which is impossible to believe given how gorgeous the painting is. The setting was a recreation spot on the Seine at Bougival, just outside Paris. Here one could bathe, row, and relax at a cafe. Monet and Renoir together painted at the site in the summer of 1869. The freedom of paint application is really striking here. We have fat, short strokes of color placed right next to each other without blending. They help the surface vibrate with a sense of motion. There are indications in the layers of the paint that Monet had difficulty representing the boats as they moved in the water, which helps us to see that he really was trying to capture the impression he had of the scene, of its light, color, and shifting shapes. This painting, and most Impressionist paintings, in truth, were not, however, made at one sitting. That's a myth that really doesn't hold true. In 1870-1871, life in Paris was disrupted by the Franco-Prussian War. Many artists left the city. Some, like Monet, even left the country. He went to London, where he was still highly productive. The Thames below Westminster, signed and dated 1871, was one of the paintings he made with London settings. And it's appropriate, of course, that one of these paintings is in the National Gallery in London. Like many visitors to the city before him, Monet was fascinated with London fogs. In the background here, we can see the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Bridge silhouetted against a gray-yellow sky. Keep in mind that these were actually new buildings and structures in the 19th century. In the foreground, however, Monet focused on a jetty into the Thames where people stopped to converse while ships moved towards us from the middle ground. Overall, it is a calm scene and one with muted tones appropriate to what Monet could see in such cloudy and foggy conditions. Yet he also conveyed a sense of humidity and even of the brightening of the sky during the day. One could describe this painting as based on the time-honored concept of atmospheric perspective. However, there is a kind of unity of the surface created by the texture of paint and the flatness of individual strokes. Once again, our attention is brought right back up onto the surface of the canvas. In the water, such separate brushstrokes convey movement and light reflections. After Monet moved back to Paris, a number of the young painters with whom he felt kinship began to exhibit their work together. The first of the 8 group exhibitions took place in 1874. The name Impressionists was first bestowed on these artists by a hostile critic responding to Monet's painting called Impression Sunrise. Starting in 1877, Monet painted around 12 scenes of a railway station in Paris. Gare Saint-Lazare, which is signed, is one of 4 that depicts the interior of the station looking outward. The project was the first of Monet's series on one subject, and this was clearly an important one to him. He actually rented a small apartment and studio space nearby. The station was already familiar to him, since trains to places such as Bougival, where he had painted earlier, and Argenteuil, where he currently lived, left from the station. Smoke rises from 2 trains that sit here in the station. A third has already departed at left. Indistinct figures move through the large space. The roof looms high overhead, but is obscured by the smoke in spots. The scene is a mix of gray, black, blue, and white tones. Monet would work on several versions of the scene on any given day, and such paintings were carefully thought out despite their freshness and appearance of spontaneity. Notice, for instance, how on the upper right, Monet had left an area of the roof blank so that he could add the smoke on top of the ground here without the colors mixing with darker underpaint. On the left side, he does exactly the opposite with the roof. He took advantage of the tones of the bluish-black roof to darken the smoke that appears against it. It is certainly a modern subject, though not one that was unprecedented. Think, for instance, of Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed. But the train is not really the subject here so much as the life it builds through people moving quickly from one place to another, with this activity centered on these new large stations, a new kind of building for the modern city. There was nothing static about the style of the individual Impressionist painters. Monet's Water Lily Pond, signed and dated 1899, is certainly evidence of changes in his style and subject matter. This scene took place on the grounds of Monet's own property in Giverny, where he had moved in 1883. From then on, he turned away from Paris as subject to the countryside or to older monuments such as Rouen Cathedral. Monet painted primarily in series at this point. There are 18 different paintings, for instance, of the bridge and the Water Lily Pond. We see from close up the Japanese-style bridge built by Monet over this pond. No sky is visible here, but the dappled light on the lush foliage behind the bridge and reflections in the water testify to the presence of sunlight. The surface of the painting is correspondingly dense as well. We can make out individual touches of paint, but here they make up layers that are woven together, creating a tapestry-like effect of color and texture. While each individual touch might have been added quickly, the painting itself developed over time, with Monet always striving to be faithful to specific light effects at specific times a day. You have to imagine him going out in front of the motif with several canvases and picking them up and putting them down as the light changed during the day. The blue, green, purplish, and reddish touches of paint here draw us in. And viewed from close by, we could even imagine this is an abstract painting. For Monet, nature and the act of painting nature seem to become one and the same thing, especially in these later paintings. The career of Pierre-Auguste Renoir also shows the developments of his style from his most impressionist period of the 1870s to a more classically conceived model from the 1880s onward. Renoir, whose dates were 1841 to 1919, came from Limoges. He first trained in Paris as a porcelain painter, actually, and then entered Glaire's studio in 1861, the year before Monet came there. Like Monet, he would take up landscape, working out of doors in the 1870s, and was also drawn to scenes of modern life. Although Renoir exhibited in the first 3 Impressionist exhibitions, he returned to the official Paris Salon in 1879, and as we will see, moderated his Impressionist style in the 1880s. Renoir moved to the south of France in 1907, where he continued to work. There are 10 paintings by Renoir in the National Gallery. The skiff, La Yole, from 1875, is another example of the Impressionist love of subjects about leisure and landscapes with water. The scene is likely on the Seine, and it conveys the shimmer of a warm summer day. We can compare this painting to Monet's Bathers from 1869. The overall tonality is lighter here, and Renoir's paint application, while in separate strokes, is certainly less aggressive than Monet's. It is the brightness of the color tones, some of them applied directly from tubes of commercially prepared paint that artists now used, that most draws our attention here. In particular, scholars have noted how Renoir takes advantage of the idea of complementary colors. Notice how the orange boat and the blue water, when juxtaposed, each appear more intense in tone. Parisians could access such recreation as boating by taking trains out of the city. We actually see such a train in the background, suggesting that city, suburb, and even countryside were no longer entirely separate realms. One of Renoir's subjects of modern life was the theater, but he typically depicted the audience rather than the performers. At the theater, from 1876, 1877, a signed painting shows a young woman peering eagerly at the stage, which is unseen to us. This woman's light blue bonnet partly hides the face of her female companion to the right. This kind of composition that suggests a real-world view rather than one that was perfectly arranged and composed was one found in many Impressionist paintings. It went along with painting subjects of modern life. She is dressed all in shades of blue and at the height of fashion of late 1876 or early 1877, how we can date the painting. The rest of the audience is shown at the left on two levels. Here the faces are blurred in order to keep our attention on the young woman and returning back to it. X-radiographs revealed that Renoir changed his composition radically, however. He originally painted two other pretty large-scale figures leaning forward on the left, and it appears they were a man and a woman. Traces of the man's head can still be made out in the painting between the young woman and the audience view that Renoir tried to cover up, but it didn't do so entirely. Once more, it is necessary to think of Impressionist painting as more than just a first impression. And interior scenes such as this one were typically studio productions. Sometimes sketches might be made on the spot, but where the painting was actually done in the studio. Another Renoir painting in the National Gallery attests to this fact that these are not just first impressions quite strongly. The Umbrellas, a signed painting, has been dated from 1881 to 1886 because technical studies indicate that Renoir put this painting aside for some years after he first composed it before bringing it to its final form. In this urban out-of-doors scene, we see a crowd of Parisians at the start of a rainstorm. Male and female, children and adults are all crowded together, but all look perfectly happy. One figure really stands out, however, and that's the young woman at the left, who wears a dress of a very different shade of blue than those on the right side of the painting. See how blue is really the dominant color in this work. Renoir became dissatisfied with his style in the early 1880s, especially after traveling to Italy in 1882. There he saw paintings by Renaissance and Baroque artists that somehow seemed grander and more monumental in their structure than his own paintings. After this time, Renoir came to believe that he had come to the end of Impressionism as a style. That's what he wrote himself. For whatever reason, Renoir had put down this painting again after first painting the composition around 1881, and it seems that it was probably as late as 1886 when he took it up again. This time he concentrated on the woman at the left, removing her hat and repainting her dress in a current style. All the umbrellas were actually added at this stage of work as well. Renoir used a different blue pigment here for the painting of umbrellas and of the woman on the left. Instead of the cobalt blue he had preferred and used at the right, he repainted this woman using artificial ultramarine, which he used to produce gray-blue tones. And so we come full circle with our pigments, from real to artificial ultramarine. Renoir also suppressed his typically soft brushwork here. Compare her face, the woman on the left, to the woman in the feathered hat, right of center. He also repainted part of the figure of the man at the left. These changes do add a greater sense of stability to the design on a diagonal axis that moves from the lower left to the upper right. Renoir's quest for a more timeless art of painting would also lead him away from these modern urban life subjects. This was actually his very last large-scale urban scene that he painted. Camille Pissarro, whose dates were 1830 to 1903, never turned away from urban subjects, but his preference was for street scenes viewed from above. These are townscapes, however, rather than scenes about people. Among the 6 Pissarro paintings in the National Gallery is one nocturnal scene, Boulevard Montmartre at night, from 1897. This may have been an experiment by the painter, for night scenes were rare in his art, and the painting is both unsigned and undated. We know, however, that Pissarro lived for 2 months in the winter of 1897 at a Paris hotel that overlooked this boulevard. He painted a series of views from here at different times of day, perhaps following the lead of Monet working in series. It is a wonderful evocation of the liveliness of a street scene lit by gas lamps and storefronts. Pissarro's typically more delicate brushwork gives way in this case to bolder strokes. Note how those that make up the sky move upward on the canvas, creating a kind of counter movement to the perspective of the scene that funnels our view backward to the horizon. So it's as if we kind of rush back in our view and then come right back out through the sky. Dabs of separate color to make up the stores, restaurants, and carriages were boldly set down here unblended. The whole vibrates and even shimmers, I think, the way a great Impressionist painting will. At a few points in this lecture, I have mentioned pigments, canvases, tubes of paint. It strikes me that this would be a good moment to discuss some technical points about painting in the 19th century. The National Gallery book, Art in the Making, Impressionism, is an invaluable resource on which I have depended here. In France and other countries, materials had become more standard starting in the later 17th century. By the time of the Impressionists, a painter hardly had to know how to do much of anything except how to put paint on a canvas, though of course some artists did know much more than this. Canvases are a good place to start. Standard sizes had been in place since at least the mid-18th century, possibly earlier. We have letters by the Impressionists that would refer to going out to paint with a canvas of a specific number that referred to the size. A painter might say, I went out yesterday with a number 50 and had a wonderful day out painting. They were typically bought, these canvases, already stretched as well. There were 3 basic formats: figure, landscape, and marine, sea painting, which referred to their proportions. Canvas came in various grades and, if desired, could be bought by the meter instead of pre-sized. Canvases were now typically bought already primed as well. One could either get a single or a double ground, depending in part on how much of the weave of the canvas the painter wished to have incorporated into the painting, also on how fine that weave was. The ground was frequently composed of linseed oil, lead white, and chalk. Impressionist paintings often had colored grounds for their top ground layer. This could have been special ordered from a colorman, a paint supplier, or mixed and put on top of a commercially prepared ground by the painter in his or her studio. Renoir, for instance, often liked to put the grounds on his paintings himself. What about pigments and paint? We know that pre-ground pigments were available in Europe by the 17th century, but the entire process of purchasing both them and ready-made paints was far more developed by the mid-19th century. A color merchant might also sell canvas and papers in addition to paints and palettes. Color merchants were distinct from the actual color manufacturers who produced the materials. However, the color merchants did grind pigments, and by the time of the Impressionists, packaged paint in tubes. An American had actually invented the collapsible paint tube in 1841. This proved a great boon to the Impressionists for facilitating their work out of doors. The Impressionists tended to work with the same small group of color merchants over a period of decades. They did this in order to obtain paints of consistent quality and make it easier when they had a special order. The rise of chemistry as a modern science in the 18th and 19th centuries had a direct effect on artists through the creation of many synthetic pigments. I mentioned earlier Renoir's use of artificial ultramarine. This was invented in the 1820s. These pigments were often more stable than natural pigments and in many cases less expensive to make. The Impressionists, by and large, did not want their paintings to be varnished after they dried. While varnishes do protect paint layers from dirt, they also change the sense of the colors, making them slightly less brilliant, and can affect the sense of texture as well. The Impressionists wanted us to have an unmediated sense of their paint. However, most of these paintings have been varnished at some point in their lifetimes. And in truth, an unvarnished painting is a challenging object for conservators, since long accumulated dust settles right on and even into the uppermost paint layer itself. Finally, what about frames? Gilded frames, first made of wood and then later of plaster, were dominant in the first half of the 19th century, as they had been all through the 18th century. The Impressionists, though, were experimenters in this realm as well, often first exhibiting their paintings in white or colored frames of simple design. However, dealers and often private clients maintained a preference for gold frames, and today that is still the most common type of frame you will see on an Impressionist painting in a museum. The Impressionist painters were as willing to experiment as both their critics and their supporters maintained. Some of their activities, such as making oil paintings on a decent scale out of doors, were really only possible because of technical developments, such as the marketing of oil paints ready mixed in convenient tubes. Yet the most radical part of their art was their vision of what art could be in terms of both subject matter and style. We've seen changes happen in both of these areas over many centuries, but the changes that happened in the second half of the 19th century were both more pronounced and more frequent than had ever been true before. This will become clear in the next and final lecture when we look at the art of Edgar Degas and then turn to the post-Impressionist painters.